Welcome back. This is AP Environmental Science, Chapter 5, and today we're going to talk about biodiversity and evolution. And as we learned in Chapter 1, biodiversity is a very important environmental indicator. And biodiversity tells us the overall health of an ecosystem, and it can really tell us whether an ecosystem is under stress or not. The biodiversity that we see here on Earth is just a result of the evolution and extinction that has occurred over the Earth's 4.5 billion years of existence. And so understanding the processes of evolution and extinction is going to help us understand present-day changes in an environment and help us make predictions and understand what's taking place more accurately. And so what we have on the first slide here is two forests, one that has a very diverse plant community. And if you have a high diversity in plant community, then you're going to have a high diversity in other animal life. And so this untouched forest is going to have a very high diversity, a very healthy system. Where this figure right here, figure 5.1b, is a forest plantation, and it's just single tree species. And then you have some grasses and such. And so the biodiversity in this case, because you have a low diversity of plant life in this community, you're going to have a low animal diversity as well. I saw this in Costa Rica. I think I shared with you last time the difference between a pristine rainforest and a banana plantation. If not, I'll share you that information on Wednesday. So we have different types of diversity that all contribute to the overall biodiversity of the planet. First is ecosystem diversity, and so we have differences in ecosystems, and they all butt up against each other. Remember, the boundaries are very difficult to determine. So you have a freshwater ecosystem right here. You have an alpine ecosystem at the top of the mountain. You have an ecosystem here, an ecosystem here, an ecosystem here. So all these different ecosystems and this diversity, this high diversity of ecosystem is going to really contribute to the overall variety of species that it can hold. And that's where we have species diversity. And so all these different ecosystems and their being in close proximity is going to contribute to a very high animal and plant diversity, species diversity. So ecosystem diversity contributes to species diversity. And then we also have genetic diversity. And so within one single species, we have a variety of genes. And this is called genetic diversity. And they use different colors, but in these different chipmunks, you have different genes, and so there's a genetic diversity, which is going to be the basis for change over time and evolution. And so one thing that we talk about is, well, I should go back a little bit. Try to remember back to the lecture that we had last week, and I told you that we have approximately 2 million species described thus far on Earth. Right, so that's our current biodiversity, but we know it's much higher than that. And our estimates are between, not many people say 5, but I guess some people say 5, scientists, 5 to 100 million species on Earth we think there are. Probably most scientists think within 30 million, 30 plus million is how many we have. And then remember, we're seeing an extinction rate that's higher than normal, which is about 100 species go extinct per day. And so trying to squeeze that in there. So we need to measure these things, and we know that the species on Earth are not uniformly distributed. And so we can do different things to measure and determine the health of an ecosystem. One is species richness. Species richness. And so in this figure you see this guy with this fumigator in the rainforest, and he's sending up this pesticide up into this tree, And then he has this tarp down here, and he's all the anything in that tree, particularly insects, because it's insecticide, is going to end up falling into that tarp, and then he can count those up and determine the different numbers of species, like you see here. I guarantee you in this tree, there's more than just the species that you see here. There's probably hundreds of species in this one tree in the rainforest, but they're just showing you one little picture. The different species, so we have all these different species in this tree, and so we can determine species richness of that individual tree. And that's an important thing to measure. So species richness is the number of species in a given area. We also have species evenness. So this is the measure of whether a particular ecosystem is numerically dominated by one species or are all represented by a similar number of individuals. Sorry, it's covered up a little bit. But you can see in this diagram that we have two communities of trees, and each community has the same number of species. In community 1 and 2, they both have 5 species of trees in there. So therefore the species richness is exactly the same for both 1 and for 2. And so species richness is exactly the same. However, species evenness is different. In community 1, you have a fairly even community, 25% across the board, where in species 2, it's dominated by this A species that you see here. It's dominated by that plant species, and you have 10%, 10%, 10% of the other ones. And so community 1 has a very even community. This means that community 1 is considered more diverse. Okay, so make sure that you remember that if there's the same species richness and different evenness, and this one has a better evenness, then this community has a higher diversity. Okay. So we're going to talk about evolution because that really is what drives biodiversity. This is what's given us this great diversity on Earth, is evolution. And so there's different mechanisms that determine how things change over time. And so we're going to talk about those. We'll talk about different things of evolution. A lot of this may be review. If you had good biology class, then this should be review. And so in Darwin's On the Origin of Species, the first thing he talks about is artificial selection. And artificial selection is what you're seeing here. Artificial selection, which there's a couple more slides that I'll talk about. Artificial selection is going to be where humans are determining the traits that are passed on to the next generation. And so they're going to determine, hey, I really like the size of this leaf. It's bigger, and so I'm going to save that seed and pass it on to the next generation. We've done this for pretty much everything. Horses, cows, pigs, chickens, any agricultural crops. We've artificially selected certain traits to be the ones that we want. So originally we had this wild mustard, and farmers saved seed and passed along through artificial selection the traits that they wanted. And so that's how we got Brussels sprouts and cauliflower and broccoli and all these different things from this one wild mustard. So artificial selection gives us these very, very, very different different crops that you see here. So they're all based off this wild mustard, and farmers made all these different types of plants that we have today, and you probably wouldn't know that just by looking at it because they look so different from the original ancestor. This is artificial selection. And so I guess the slides got mixed up. Make sure to take a look at this slide. It just provides you with some basic definitions that you should know. There's some important ones here. So make sure to review that. Should be review. This is a very important one right here that we'll talk a lot about, mutation. Mutation is just a random change in the genetic code, and this is going to be a big component in terms of things evolving over time. And so we have two types of ways that things evolve. One is through artificial selection. We just sort of briefly introduced that. That's when humans determine which individuals breed. So you have a cow that produces a lot of milk, or you're going to allow that one to breed and pass down that trait. Whereas a cow that doesn't produce a lot of milk, you're not going to allow it to breed, and so that therefore that trait sort of dies. Evolution by natural selection is when nature selects the traits. And so the environment determines which individuals are most likely to survive and then therefore reproduce. So the strong are the traits that are favored in that particular ecosystem. Those organisms, plant or animal, are going to survive and then pass on those traits that help them survive. That's through natural evolution by natural selection. So, sorry, we're flip-flopping a little bit. Here's artificial selection. Man, over time, selected different breeds of dogs. So they decided, well, we really like this long coat, and the long coat we see here. So the longer the coat, well, we're going to breed those dogs. The coats that are not that long, we're not going to breed them, right? Or, you name it. The variety of dogs out there. That was all through artificial selection. Man determining what traits they wanted to pass on to the next generation. And they all come from the gray wolf, and this has been confirmed through genetic testing and such. We'll talk a little more about that later. So Darwin's theory of evolution, here's just some key points here that he determined in his On the Origin of Species in the 1800s. And so here's sort of some key understanding or key points that he points out. Individuals produce an excess of offspring. And so he noticed that different marine organisms, blanking out on which one he pointed out in his book, but they produce an excess of offspring, and that's important because nature is going to take a fair percentage of those, and so you have to produce a lot of them because not all the offspring will survive, and so you need to produce many, many offspring. Individuals within that offspring differ in their traits. So just like you look different than your brother or sister, same for any other organism. Individuals are going to differ in their traits, a whole number of traits. Difference in the traits can be passed on from parents to offspring. So you get your traits from your parents. And then the last thing here, which is the most important, differences in traits are associated with differences in the ability to survive and reproduce. And so here's the key. You make a lot of offspring. They all have different traits, right? They all have different traits. They're passed from their parents, and their parents have survived. They're passed to their offspring, those traits that help that parent generation survive. And these differences are going to give the ability for the offspring to survive and therefore reproduce. So we'll continue on this, sort of building on our understanding of evolution, artificial selection, natural selection, very important. Artificial selection by man, we see this in so many things around us that things change over time. In fact, becomes so different we can't even recognize that it came from a particular ancestor. And natural selection, same deal, just nature's choosing what survives and reproduce, not man. So this is part 1 of chapter 5, and we'll have a few more parts to come.